Welcome to Penenden Heath, a lovely little recreational area, play area here in Maidstone in Kent. Now, Tom, I hear you asking, you go to places where horrible things have happened. What are you doing at a lovely play area? Well, let's just say that recreation wasn't the only thing that used to happen here. In fact, something a lot darker and more sinister went on, not exactly where I'm standing, but pretty close, for hundreds of years. And whereas it's quite nice now, Penenden Heath used to be called the Killing Fields of Kent. Yep, Penenden Heath was a place of execution, where punishment was doled out to those who were considered to have committed a crime, and a crime worthy of death. Although, as we know, many crimes back in the day probably weren't worthy of death. But places where justice was meted out in whatever capacity was deemed acceptable were usually pretty important, and Penenden Heath was certainly important. It first appeared in the Domesday Book of 1086, although at this point it was called Penenden, and throughout time it's evolved through various different styles and spellings, including Penenden, Pickenden, Penenden, but it seems as though the name may have derived from the original Saxon word pinion, which meant to punish. We don't know this for a fact, but considering how many executions took place here, it wouldn't surprise me if it was named after what went down here. So, taking us way back long before the Norman conquest of England, Penenden Heath was the administrative heart of Saxon Kent, serving as a form of court and meeting place, a venue for shire moots, so open-air courts where legal, political, religious matters were decided. And the assemblies that happened here brought together various different types of leaders from across the county, including lay and spiritual leaders. There were bishops, abbots, earls, everybody would come here and take part in what was really an early form of representative governance in England, a kind of early democracy. And shortly after the Norman conquest of 1066, it hosted one of the most significant legal assemblies in medieval England. A 3-day hearing was ordered by William I following accusations against Odo of Bayeux, his own half-brother and the former Earl of Kent. Now, Odo is actually cropped up in one of my earliest videos. Way back in the day, I made a video about Chiddingstone, and Odo reared his somewhat controversial head there as well. And at this point, he was suspected of defrauding both the Crown and the Church during his time as Earl of Kent. An inquiry was convened at Penenden, and nobles from across the country were summoned, and ultimately, they got a bunch of lands and property back from Odo. Penenden Heath was also a spot for protest, for public assembly and dissent. And in 1381, Wat Tyler gathered his supporters there to protest against wage controls and the poll tax. From Penenden Heath, they marched through Maidstone and on to London, confronting royal authority in what became known as the Peasants' Revolt. And if you know anything about the Peasants' Revolt, you probably know that it didn't really end that well for Tyler or the peasants. And in May 1648, during the English Civil War, George Goring, the Earl of Norwich, and the leader of Kent's royalist forces assembled about 7,000 men up on Penenden Heath, and they attempted, unsuccessfully, to defend Maidstone from the Parliamentarian army, who were commanded by Thomas Fairfax, also known to those who he commanded as Black Tom because of his dark hair. Here he is having a wonderful time on his fancy horse. The heath itself used to be a lot bigger than this. In fact, at one point it was probably about 20 times bigger than what we see here behind me today. You had the heath, you had a lot more woodland around on this hill, and you had a couple of houses that served as meeting points. It essentially served as a big, open, wooded hill right in the middle of everything. And as you know, we humans like to be very symbolic about where we place things. Location has always been very important to us, and what a big hill in the middle of Kent symbolises is that's the middle, that's where all the important stuff should happen. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, that important stuff also involved deciding who was going to die. Now we get to the grisly bit. Few features throughout its history have defined Penenden Heath more starkly than its long association with punishment and death. Until they were wiped out by building works, place names around here such as Gallows Hill, Gallows Wood, and Hangman's Lane preserved the memory of what went down here for a long time, all the way from Anglo-Saxon times until the executions stopped in 1830. Criminals were tried on the Heath in the original Saxon court and then by the various other courts in the hundreds of years that followed. They were then marched uphill to the gallows, which were traditionally formed by 3 trees, one of which apparently survives, though I've not been able to find out which one it is and if it's actually still there. Now, where I'm standing on what remains of the actual heath itself is not actually where the gallows stood. That was on the aptly named Gallows Hill, which was just over there. It is very icy today. It's taking all of my control and balance here not to stack it every couple of seconds. All right, let's start again. Welcome to Heathfield Road, or as it used to be called, Hangman's Lane. I don't know why they changed it. There's nothing wrong with Hangman's Lane. And yes, like a lot of places in the UK, for hundreds and hundreds of years, it didn't look like this. There was no quaint little residential area. There were no houses here. People didn't live here. Up on this hill, there were 3 tall trees. They apparently stood at the very peak of the hill, where everybody could see them. And these were known as the hanging trees. This is where, once they decided that, publicly executing people was pretty cool and something they wanted to keep doing, this is where they built the first permanent gallows to be on the site. Now, there are a lot of tall trees around here, one of which they're actually chopping down right now by the looks of things. But despite the number of very, very tall trees up on this hill, I'm doubting that any of them are the same gallows trees that were here back in 1830 and before. I'd imagine the amount of development that's happened here has long since wiped out most of the vegetation that was here hundreds of years ago. There's obviously since been enough time for a lot of this new stuff to grow up. But for the longest time, where I'm walking right now would have been a wooded hillside with these 3 trees right at the top. And they would have been a sinister reminder of what waited anybody who chose to break the law. This is another one of those situations where you wonder whether any of the people living in any of these very lovely houses around here have any idea the significance or what the significance of this place they live in used to be. You can imagine kids back in 1830 and before running around the woodland here, daring each other to get as close to the gallows as they could. In historian Edward Hasted's The History and Topographical Survey of the County of Kent, 2nd edition, volume 4, Canterbury, 1798, his brief but stark description of Penenden Heath tells you everything you need to know. At this point in Hasted's survey, it was being called Penenden Heath, where he describes, "This heath has been time out of mind used for all county meetings, and for the general business of it. The county house, for this purpose, a poor low shed, is situated on the north side of it, where the sheriff continues to hold his county court monthly. On a conspicuous hill on the opposite side of the heath is the gallows, for the public execution of criminals condemned at the assizes." It's also interesting that when you look at what Edward Hasted said about this location, and talking about humanity's simplicity when it comes to placing sites of importance within the geography, that the building where everything happened was, yes, it was on the hill, but it wasn't right at the top. When he describes what was opposite the building on the very conspicuous hill above everything else, The most important thing that leaders, the authority, wanted you to be able to see from miles around were the gallows. In fact, the French word for gallows, potence, actually comes from the Latin word potentia, meaning power, which pretty concisely sums up what they were actually supposed to represent. Well, I'm now in the woods back alongside Penenden Heath, and this is probably a lot more representative of what Gallows Hill would have been like before all of the development took place. And there's also and no offence if you live here because it's awesome, there is also kind of a creepy witch's house just on the edge of these woods, which just adds to the sinister nature of the area, or how it used to be. It does add to the gravitas of how ominous the area must have been at the time, though, because it was 3 tall trees under which the gallows stood in the middle of a wood on a hill. It doesn't get more fairy tale ominous than that. Although I can't imagine back in the day there were huge power lines right in the middle of that forest. Kind of taking the spooky edge off of things a little bit, if I'm honest. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a tree hugger, but I like trees. Trees are cool. And if I'm honest, I feel a bit bad that they also happened to be the perfect thing to hang a man from before people actually decided to build purpose-built gallows. It is dark and it is sinister, but there is part of me that thinks way back, hundreds, thousands of years, to who was the first person to look at a tree branch and go, could hang a man off of that. And in 1652, hanging wasn't the only thing that took place here at Penenden Heath. From the medieval period right through to the 17th century, those unfortunate enough to be accused of witchcraft were also tried here. And in 1652, 7 women were hanged at Penenden Heath. They included Anne Ashby, Mary Brown, Anne Martin, Mildred Wright, Susan Pickenden, Anne Wilson of Cranbrook, and Mary Reed of Lenham. At the time, these women were alleged to have entered pacts with the devil, confessed to being in possession of familiars, and apparently one of them was reported to have sent her spirit to harm the child of a neighbour. Some locals say that if you listen very carefully, in the middle of the night, across the heath, sometimes you can hear the faint cackling of witches. I mean, it's either witches or it's the monotonous drone of the M20 behind me. In all honesty, though, it is, like so many things, a tragedy that obviously there were innocent people put to death here over the hundreds of years that it carried on for, but that obviously in the case of those women, I mean, they definitely weren't witches. So if anybody was going to be killed, and in the most horrifying way, it's just horrible stuff. And fascinatingly, Maidstone Borough Council have been moving to get a pardon from the government for these women, amongst hundreds of other women. Some of their trial was recorded in a pamphlet called A Prodigious and Tragical History of the Arraignment, Trial, Confession and Condemnation of 6 Witches at Maidstone. Should probably add as well that a lot of pamphlets during this period were known to be produced incredibly quickly and not necessarily contain the most reliable accounts. One extract from the pamphlet goes as follows. The said Ashby alias Cobbler, in view of this observator, fell into an ecstasy before the bench, and swelled into a monstrous and vast bigness, screeching and crying out very dolefully. And being recovered, and demanded if the devil at that time had possessed her, she replied, she knew not that, but she said that the spirit rug came out of her mouth like a mouse. The said Anne Ashby further confessed that the devil had given them a piece of flesh, which whensoever they should touch, they should thereby affect their desires,
that this flesh lay hid amongst grass, in a certain place which she named, where upon search it was found accordingly. This flesh was of sinewy substance and scorched, and was seen and felt by this observator, and reserved for public view, at the sign of the Swan in Maidstone.
All, of course, sounds very convincing. But hey, different times, am I right? Though having said that, I have occasionally seen my wife messing about with weird scorched flesh. Who do you get in touch with in 2025 if you suspect your wife of making a pact with the devil? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Now, of course, these women weren't witches. They were probably poor, unwell, or simply healers trying to help people. Like, they obviously weren't witches. And so nicely, there is actually a small sculpture at the Heath today, which represents not just the site's history as a meeting place, but also those who were of any significance to it. So included in that is a witch, who's actually shown to actually be a healer helping somebody. Up until 1820, prisoners who were taken to the gallows were transported to the site by cart and turned off, so to speak, which essentially means stood on the back of a cart, a noose wrapped around their neck, and then pushed off the back. But in the 1820s, a new permanent gallows design with a trapdoor was put at the site. Bodies of those executed were buried nearby in the wood, and apparently later, a new clock was constructed at the crossroads, and when it was, they found around 300 skeletons. I've not seen any reports of skeletons that were found whilst the new development was going on, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are still some hidden up there on the hill. Okay, I had to show you this. I found an absolutely epic list of executions at Maidstone from 1735 to 1930, which lists date of execution, the date of assizes, names, crime and victim details as well, and location. And as we can see, place of execution, Penenden Heath, Penenden Heath, Penenden Heath. Although one here, John Breads, for the murder of Alan Grebel, specifically states that after execution, his body was hanged in chains at Rye. But everything else, Penenden Heath, Penenden Heath, Penenden Heath, and it is for all kinds of stuff. We've got burglary, housebreaking, a lot of highway robbery, arson, murder. The first we have here is the 27th of March 1735. A man named William Fidger, straight out of a Dickens novel, was hanged for burglary. Some that stand out, we've got 1742, sheep theft, William Pullen. In 1752, a man called Dennis Doyle apparently shot at. It doesn't say who Dennis Doyle shot at, but he was executed for it. Also 1752, William Hatfield was at large. A lot of highwaymen here. 1775, John Reynolds. Bestiality. Fortunately, from what I've seen so far, the only case of bestiality. One interesting crime I've seen is uttering. I wasn't sure what uttering was. Apparently, uttering is counterfeiting. It's publishing, selling counterfeit documents. Now, of course, this isn't everyone who was executed at Penenden Heath. This is just a list that's been compiled here by the Kent Online Parish Clerks. Thank you for all of this work. So the full list, you can only imagine how many people were executed here over the years. The last public execution at Penenden Heath took place on Christmas Eve 1830. Executioner William Calcraft hanged John Dyke along with brothers William and Henry Packman, who were aged 20 and 18, for arson. They were hanged for the alleged crime of having burnt a hayrick, and have not been able to find any proof, but the general consensus is that they were later found to have been innocent. Apparently the evidence is that several years after Dyke's hanging, another man on his deathbed admitted to being the real arsonist, but apparently he was the last person to be hanged here. Calcraft himself was a pretty notorious executioner and is thought to have executed at least 400 people. The execution itself at the time was viewed with something of a sympathetic eye. The judge, despite the two brothers, William and Henry, having been found guilty, was encouraged by the jury to show mercy, with people believing that they'd been influenced by others, including John Dyke. The judge did not take the same view, and so on December 24th, William Calcraft was waiting to do his duty. Apparently the crowd that had gathered for the execution were largely sympathetic to the brothers, at least. Apparently one of the Packman brothers was seen looking at the gallows and saying,
"That looks an awful thing."
Just before their execution, after they'd climbed the steps of the scaffold, the chaplain who was present said to Dyke,
"Now you have come to the worst, and there is no chance of escape. Do tell the truth."
and apparently Dyke's answer to that was a loud,
"I am innocent, and Hewitt and his wife have sworn falsely against me. Mind the 9th commandment."
The brothers were then given the same chance to address the crowd. They claimed that a man named Goodman had urged them to set fire to the barn, along with another man named Bishop. Apparently the brothers then turned to each other and shook hands. Then, Henry Packman and John Dyke's hands were tied behind their backs. But for some reason Calcraft missed William, and so when Calcraft began to place the white hoods over their heads, William tore his off and declared that he wished to see the faces of the crowd before them. They were then hanged. An hour after their deaths, their bodies were cut down. And here he is. John's grave is here at Holy Cross Church in Bearsted, not far from Penenden Heath. I honestly thought this was going to be more difficult to find, but this grave marker is actually being kept in really good condition. There's almost fresh flowers on it, and the marker itself is very clean. If anyone local has any more information, I would love to hear it in the comments below, because this declaration of innocence on this grave marker is obviously pretty definitive, and I've not been able to find any proof beyond, a local story that another man a few years later admitted guilt on his deathbed, which may very well be true, but it's not exactly, it wouldn't really hold up in court. So if anyone out there has any more information on that, then do let me know in the comments. And whether you think he was innocent or not, it's really just an early example of why government-mandated death, government-mandated execution is not a very good way of punishing people, because John Dyke certainly wasn't the first, and unfortunately certainly won't be the last person to be executed and then later found to be innocent of the crime. And you can't really take death back. Apparently, the man who confessed is also buried in the same cemetery, but they buried him on the other side of the church from John, so as not to, get on the nerves of the family of John Dyke. I have had a brief look for people who died, a few years after 1830, but it's kind of searching for a needle in a haystack, so I gave up pretty quickly. If the story is true, then somewhere in this graveyard is the real arsonist. In 1831, executions were moved from Penenden Heath to the newly constructed gallows outside Maidstone prison. Now that it was no longer needed for this grisly purpose, Penenden Heath became a place of leisure. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it hosted cricket matches, and in 1882, following extensive landscaping works, it officially became a public recreation ground, just as it is today. So, over the course of the 19th century, the heath was gradually hemmed in by the development going on all around it until we were left with what you see here behind me. And a site that's tall central location was once chosen for demonstrating what happens when you do wrong. A site of intimidation and punishment and consequence became a site for living, for homes, somewhere that people could come to relax and play. It's a pretty sizable 180 from where it was for hundreds of years prior. And there's barely a sign of what used to be here, which is mad when in reality it was used for killing for far longer than it's been a place to live. Well, from the cold, foggy, killing fields of Penenden Heath, I hope you found this video interesting. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more from me. and leave a comment if you found this interesting, or if you've got any other subjects, places you want me to go, things you want me to look into. I'm always looking for suggestions in the comments. So, on that note, I'll see you in the next one.